get cracking. Welcome to this webinar, this Innovation Forum webinar. I'm Ian Welsh and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. I'll leave the poll running just for now, but please do fill in whatever commodity is relevant for you. So in this webinar, we're going to delve into the evolving regulatory environment impacting commodity supply chains, focusing in particular on the EU Deforestation Regulation, the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. As they come fully into play, businesses will have to understand and adapt to the inevitable change. We've an excellent panel to help frame our discussion. I'm joined by Pallavi Sharma from the Global Rights Compliance, Felipe Carazao from Tropical Forest Alliance, and Belinda Borck from Tony's Chocolonely, or Tony's Open Chain. Welcome to you all. I will turn to our panel shortly, but we do want to hear from you all. Please do be thinking about points and questions that you'd like me to put to the panel and write them into the Q&A box on your Zoom window. You can, of course, like other questions by clicking the thumbs up, and the more likes a question gets, the greater the chances I will put that question to our panel. Okay, can we get the results of our poll now? Okay, so we're quite well represented across the board. Excellent. Well, thank you very much for taking part. Pallavi, welcome. Let me turn to you. Can we leave the poll up, if possible? Pallavi, perhaps you can give us your take on where regulation is right now, and for, as you described when we were talking about this before, your buzz update on progress. Pallavi.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Ian, and thanks everyone for having me here. This is a very interesting subject, and just for a bit of a background, I am a lawyer and I work a lot on the EU legislations that are coming up on human rights due diligence, sustainability, and so on. So in interest of time, I understand that the CS3D has recently been passed, and even though I hear some murmurs of discontent, it's nowhere even close to the discourse on the EUDR, and rightly so. Because with the CS3D, we still have a bit of time before the kickoff happens. The first compliance date is, I think, 2027. But the EUDR, it's here and it's now. So it's realistically, companies are a bit worried what is going to happen to their shipments that are already starting out to reach the EU at the end of this year. So let's speak about the EUDR a little bit. So most of us in the room are already familiar with the building blocks of this law. It's been passed to combat deforestation and forest degradation associated with 7 commodities, which are palm oil, cocoa, soy, rubber, wood, cattle, as you've already seen in the poll. And this law applies to all companies across the board working in these commodities, irrespective of the size or the turnover. And this is a bit of a sticking point for why there is so much discontentment with the implementation of this law. So coming back to your question, Ian, I've been following the developments of the EUDR and its implementation quite closely. And it would be safe to say that stakeholders from pretty much each commodity have raised some or the other kind of concerns with the implementation timeline specifically and the bureaucratic burden of this law. So if just for this audience, if I were to break down the critics into groups, the first group is agriculture and economy ministries of EU countries themselves and non-EU countries. For example, Austria has been quite a vocal critique of this law, the agriculture and economic minister of Austria. Similarly, Germany has actually come out and said that unless the EU comes up with the benchmarking system soon, they would not implement the EUDR regulation. Similarly, Brazil, India, Nigeria, countries who have a significant trade with the EU in these commodities, they have been vocal critics of this law, that how it will have an unintended consequence of shifting the market from EU to non-EU countries to weaker regulation countries without actually having an impact on deforestation level itself. So 3 kind of, the first was state and government. The second is industry associations, who rightly so are representing various segments of operators and traders in the supply chains of these commodities and are a bit worried just in terms of the sheer volume of data that has to be collected and how that data would be input in the system and how that data would be then analyzed, who will have access to it. There's a lot of proprietary information when we think about these data points. It's very reductive understanding that you ask your supplier and then they ask their supplier and then you can trace it down to the very last levels of the supply chain. But this is intellectual property. This is protected by confidentiality, competitiveness. So there are a lot of issues just with procuring this data and then finding out who is going to be using this data safely. The third category is international NGOs indigenous peoples groups and UN affiliated agencies, they are not exactly opposing the law, but they have called into question the impact of this law on especially small farmers and also indigenous systems of using and what is the word? Using and improving forests, replenishing, yes, using and replenishing forest. So these are the criticisms from the third category of stakeholders who have raised concerns over this law. In terms of why these concerns have been raised, three big ideas that jump out to me. The first one, and we would be talking about this again and again in some form or shape, it's the readiness of the EU. And I have come across this, and frankly, I'm a bit partial with the industry on this because the EU had promised a lot more than it's delivered in terms of how close we are to the compliance timeline. Number one, there is no understanding of benchmarking yet. And benchmarking the countries into low, medium, and high risk is one of the cornerstones of this law. And there has not been any information given out by EU in terms of how these countries will be benchmarked. This actually has big ramifications. For example, Germany has been saying that they are technically a low-risk country, but unless the EU comes out and says so, they will have to have the standard risk country compliance burden. So this is the first sticking point for a lot of these critiques. The second is the IT system. Honestly, I'm not an expert on that, but from what I have heard from my partners who are working in this space, the EU has piloted an IT system which will take on this data and then analyze this data, and the due diligence report will be released. And it's nowhere equipped to take on the kind of burden it is requiring producers to put, burden requiring operators and traders to put in, just in terms of the sheer volume of data. So that's two big points where the EU should come out with explanation sooner than later. Similarly, there are other pending issues like what is the definition of agroforestry? What are some ways, what is the standard of documentation that an importer needs to ask their suppliers in various countries like India and Vietnam? What kind of documentation should I ask them? What would be the standard on which this document would be reviewed? Will the standard be the same, say, if my shipment hits Rotterdam port and when my shipment hits Antwerp port? So these are the questions that are required to be sort of explained by the regulator themselves. The second point is readiness of companies and market systems, and we would be sort of demystifying this in the later course of the webinar anyway. So the market doesn't feel like it's ready enough to comply, not in terms of actually not having deforested commodities, but in terms of supplying the data. So Malaysia and Indonesia, for example, has been raising this concern that they have systems. They have systems where deforestation has actually reduced in the last couple of years. However, they don't have systems where their smallholders can actually provide data that would meet the threshold of the EUDR. So the second is the readiness of the market. The third is data protection issues that I've already spoken about. China, for example, has taken a very hard stand. For them, they have domestic regulation that sort of protects sharing of this geolocation data beyond a certain authorities. So how would this play out? Would China stop trading with the EU? Would EU give any concessions and so on? And the last, and I'm going to just briefly touch upon this and not really go into it, it's the competitiveness and regulatory burden. I'm sure some of you must have heard about the Draghi report that came out a couple of days ago. It's the report on EU competitiveness in general. And one of the things that it has said is that this regulatory burden is actually slow down the EU economy because companies will not be incentivized to innovate. Companies will not be incentivized to be competitive. So this is another huge criticism of why stakeholders have been asking for either pushing of the implementation timeline or rolling back. So just circling back, final answer to your question, Ian, where I stand, I don't think the law would be scrapped off under any circumstances because this doesn't signal well for the EU that they are bowing under the pressure of industry or other groups. However, considering that now we are hearing within the EU Parliament murmurs of discontent, for example, the President's party herself has said that 2-year deferral would be a good idea. Similarly, the Agriculture Commissioner of the EU has said that 1 year should at least be a realistic timeline to defer this law. So I think we may see a longer runway in terms of the penalties being imposed. So that's where I realistically see this. It won't be pushed for sure. So please prepare the way you're preparing, but maybe the regulator would not be as harsh with the penalties in the first year. Just speculation on my part. I'll stop here.
Thanks, Pallavi. I'm conscious that we're focused on EUDR there. Perhaps, audience, if you want to hear from Pallavi on more specifically on the Sustainability Due Diligence Directive or the Reporting Directive, perhaps put that in the Q&A. Conscious that the EUDR still is very much the biggest game in town. So yes, audience, please do be putting your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll come to those a little bit later. Well, thanks very much for now, Pallavi. Felipe, welcome. Perhaps you can give your perspective from your work at TFA, how you're seeing businesses engaging with the regulation, and you know, to what extent do you think there's a real need for corporate leadership for all this to work? Felipe.
Thank you, Ian, and a pleasure to be here. Yes, first, before going into the specificities of the question that you pose, you know, it's important to remember why are we here, right? Of course, as a global community, our countries have taken commitments to tackle climate change and biodiversity, and I think that this entire package of regulation under the EU, under the Green Deal, it's part of that. And of course, as you go and you zoom in, you go into the specific regulations, many of them intertwined, like the EUDR and the CS3D, as you mentioned, that are part of how do we put this reform in place, at least the EU taking a lead on trying to go about it and walk the talk. Of course, the road to hell is full of good intentions. So this is in a way what we're seeing in the EUDR. Specifically, why are we here regarding the deforestation issue? We have to understand that back some years ago, we had come with the New York Declaration on Forest, and we haven't really made a lot of progress. And there was a big push to reinvigorate this commitment through the Glasgow Declaration to tackle deforestation. And we're aware that 40% of that deforestation is linked to soft commodities. So, you know, it is an issue. It has to be addressed, and we have to eliminate the consumption of this deforestation, right? And in a way, the EUDR, it's the first attempt. Well, it's the second attempt. We had the regulation, the Environmental Act in the UK, starting to go about this issue, but the EUDR is the first attempt that tries to go beyond the legality and tap into the legality and illegality conundrum that comes about with deforestation. And therefore, it's a milestone. It's moving the agenda forward in that evolution from voluntary demand measures to mandatory market demand measures. And we're learning. Now, how do we go about this so that it's a win-win and not a lose-lose is the big challenge. And as Pallavi mentioned, the space is quite complicated, a lot of tensions within different stakeholders, and trying to see how this gets balanced out. And we have to see how it plays out coming the implementation at the end of the year. Now, coming back to your question, the engagement of the private sector, I think that the private sector, those that are really committed to these broad goals on tackling climate change and deforestation together, they are really claiming for guidance. And there has been little guidance on how to go about the nitty-gritty of the implementation in a way, because as Pallavi mentioned, some of the components of the regulation haven't even been shared to everyone, like the benchmarking system. But more than guidance itself, I think there's a collective aim from the progressive and leading corporate sector to aim for practicality. Now, this practicality comes from two different streams, if I might say, of engagement. One is around the implementation per se. How do you take this regulation as a due diligence instrument in a way and put it into practice? But also around the enabling conditions that are necessary for this implementation to be progressive. In the first stream, if I might say, practicality should consider this legal versus illegal situation. We understand that there's a framework. This provides a framework, the regulation per se, but in practice, it's difficult to go about this legal versus illegal situation because we tap into sovereignty issues, which in a way spark what Pallavi was mentioning. And even if you're able to get a good framing within producer and consumer countries, you have to think on how you have the right incentives for producer compensation where there's legal parameters in place. So it's not that simple. There's the need to improve measurement and data. This issue of data capacity, it's really important. It's not available in many producer areas, and therefore the traceability approach, which is at the core of the regulation, can be tricky. We might end up spending a lot of resources trying to answer questions that we already know, and that's a perception from the private sector. Now, we can think creatively and try to see how we go about this risk approach in a better way so that the tail doesn't wag the dog, but we go the other way around. We can identify where do we have the hotspots. Yes, try to go with deep traceability in those hotspots, but maybe in many other areas you can work around risk, try to address would it be what it's called measurable risk or low risk. There's quite a lot of debate. This even talks to the need of refining certain concepts and have a more practical way that allows us to have a cost-effective approach. And this cost-effective approach is important because not only in terms of how you go about data management and traceability and risk management, but also because there's certain parameters of the regulation that the private sector has identified that's going to represent quite an investment. Just the fact that the regulation really pursues physical segregation around the management of the commodity brings some transactional costs because there's a logistical burden to it. And there's a big chance that this could bring higher prices in food. Then the cost gets transferred to the consumers. So how to look at this other variable in terms of the associated incremental costs of bringing the implementation of the regulation, it's one of the issues that the leading corporates are trying to engage on. And finally, within this stream of implementation, I think there's a big call to enhance communication. Despite some instruments that the EU has put together, there's a need to double down on this, and not only with the corporate sector, but also with the producer countries, and try to enhance more dialogue so that we can go about this in a balanced way. Now, and finally, I would like to add that in this, the other stream of enabling conditions is also very important. Pallavi was mentioning about the importance or the tensions that exist within government to governments. And I think that corporate voices, despite all the challenges that the corporate sector is facing to address the regulation, have an opportunity to try to push for this government to government dialogue to take place. How? Of course, engaging directly the corporate voices with the governments, would it be in producer and consumer countries, trying to enhance an understanding of how a balanced approach can be and push for this government-to-government dialogue. Back in the day when the regulation was being outlined, we in the Tropical Forest Alliance generated what we call the smart mix of measures, a call for action with leading corporate voices trying to push for that. And I think that this can be shared in the link. And I think that principle is still alive. I think that when we go back and see where we are, and you go back to the original communication that set up the framing for the regulation, we still haven't made as much progress as we want in the other complementary measures of how to frame producer partnerships, how to manage traceability, how to manage a link to the finance sector. All these elements are important to enhance these conditions. The Consumer Goods Forum Forest Positive Coalition of Action has sent a message, a formal message to the EU, pushing for these complementary measures to be put in place. And I think that's very important to highlight because I think the corporate voices might have a bigger role in defining this win-win that what we can imagine. Finally, to reactivate the discussions at the multilateral level is important. I think what Pallavi mentioned, it's very important to avoid market segmentations and to have a race to the bottom on regulation, because suddenly, you have all the regions coming about this, and this could have a multilateral patchwork that might not necessarily be what we want. We're already seeing some complexities at the producer level, what's happening in Peru, in the way they manage their own interpretation of regulations. So, and I will just close by saying that there's an overall push for multi-stakeholder contributions to support forest governance as a whole, which is important to achieve these commitments. That's where I think the private sector is coming or has an opportunity to double down in this issue moving forward.
Thanks, Felipe. Just very quickly, do you think there's been an element here of be careful what you wish for? I mean, a lot of the regulation that's come in around due diligence, perhaps less so, but certainly on the EUDR, it's exactly what leading companies are asking for, and leading industry associations, groupings of companies. And now, when it's here, there seems to be a lot of noise about, well, this isn't quite right, and it's not what we actually wanted. I mean, do you think there's an element of that? We just have to kind of get on with it.
Yes, I will respond with another phrase. You said, be careful what you wish for. Also, in theory and practice are the same. In practice, they're not. So, I think that, but overall, I think that we have to strive for a level playing field. At the end, corporate action will gravitate around having fair conditions for rewarding the innovative and progressive approach towards mainstreaming sustainability parameters in trade dynamics or commercial dynamics. We haven't been able to generate the right type of setting for this to be attainable, and this puts many corporations in a doubt path, right? And then if you have to also go deep into how you go about your systems because you have all these new requirements, that could be a backfire, right? So even if many wanted to push in that direction, if the road itself becomes tricky, full of mud, you have a lot of treacherous pathways, then you might forget about what your intention was. And I think that cannot be eroded. We have to come back together. That's why the government-to-government dialogue is so important. That's why a balanced approach to these issues, because these are global issues, it's relevant, but without forgetting that we as a planet, we don't have a lot of time to lose. We have to get our act together, because at the end of the day, deforestation does contribute to climate change, does contribute to biodiversity loss, and we have to all work together in that direction.
Okay, thanks, Felipe. Do be thinking of your questions, audience. We'll be coming to those very shortly. Great to see questions coming in as we speak. Belinda, thanks for your patience and welcome. Perhaps you can give a corporate perspective on the regulatory challenges that you're meeting. And it'd be great to hear where Tony's are in terms of being in scope right now. Belinda.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to have waited. Really interesting and insightful contributions. I think I want to start off by saying that ultimately we see an absolute need for this type of legislation. So I'm very much coming at this from a positive point of view of saying there is a need for corporate responsibility, because clearly so far voluntary measures have not led to the outcomes that we are looking for, very much in line with what you just said, Felipe, regarding the, for example, 2030 agenda. Laws are crucial to actually address those global challenges, such as poverty, but very much also climate change. So I think I want to start on that positive note and kind of say that, for example, we were still an SME when we started on our traceability in cocoa in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, two countries that, even though the benchmarking hasn't happened yet, will for sure end in the high-risk category. So this is something that we have established already over a decade ago when we were a small company as well. And having this, what we call a sourcing principle in place, also again links to something that was already mentioned by the other panelists regarding putting something in practice. Because what we see as something that is absolutely vital and crucial at the moment is putting the data acquisition, procurement, and quality with the right entity. That is the beginning of the supply chain, and ultimately, therefore, the smallholder farmers and the cooperatives that should be able to make informed decisions via data ownership that they ultimately should be holding in that context. Also, the compensation for their due diligence efforts is something that just needs to be put in place, and that will otherwise prove to be a challenge, because that side of it is currently not guaranteed. What we have in place in that context is, for example, a cooperative fee per metric ton of cocoa. In general, a lot of this is also about spreading awareness around the files that are coming up. And I'm saying all of this from a perspective where very much, as Pallavi already mentioned, EUDR is around the corner. CS3D is still a bit further out, but currently Tony's is, for example, not in scope of CS3D, despite actually being able to show a lot of the due diligence steps already via our business model. So I think also linking to what the previous panelists have already touched upon. So on the one hand, the data management and data ownership, to put that in the right hands, then the practical approaches that also come with compensation, but then also the thinking around business responsibility. So for example, the passing on of costs is in this case to consumers, in this case, isn't the approach that we want to see, but this is a responsibility that we need to take and as companies. And also if we talk about competitiveness in that context, that should not happen at the expense of human rights or the environment. So already the need for a level playing field was already mentioned. So it shouldn't be a couple of front runners, and there shouldn't be a race to the bottom, already also something that was mentioned, but rather something where we do set a high standard of environmental and human rights in general in the global economy.
Thanks very much. So areas where you're not yet fully aligned or in scope, what are your concerns and what are you doing to address them?
Considering the CS3D is a directive, so will be or is in the process of being transposed into member state law. This is one of our biggest asks in that context. Basically, very shortly put, regulate us, put us in scope, because what we can demonstrate is this can be done, and we are capable of achieving the due diligence steps that are in question here. And also a little bit linking to some of the themes that were already raised, this is something that we are also approaching from a pre-competitive approach, because I am actually speaking from a perspective of Tony's Chocolonely being part of a bigger initiative, our so-called Tony's Open Chain, where we are at this point 20 different companies, we call these mission allies, who have all come together to source according to the same 5 sourcing principles. So we do have the same supply chain in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, and we do implement via the same cooperatives the same due diligence and sustainability measures that come into play. And that's also where then the post supply chain approach basically is the competition on the shelf. So Albert Heijn in the Netherlands, Waitrose in the UK are, for example, good examples of where you can find a chocolate bar of Tony's Chocolonely right next to that bar on the shelf, and it should be up to the consumer to decide after the businesses and corporates have taken their responsibility and have worked together on exactly the dialogue and the communication, as well as the collaboration with the producing countries that was previously mentioned.
Great, thanks very much. And thank you also for all your questions and points. Very much welcome them those. And bienvenue to our Francophone, our French speakers. You're, I'm afraid, pushing my French knowledge to the edge. And what we'll do is I'll ask my colleagues to just stick into the Q&A and English translation. Désolé, ma français n'est pas très bien. But we will get back to those. So first question, I'd like to, and it's something that was picked up by a lot of our panelists. Question, why do you think that the EU is so far behind in dealing with all these questions and concerns and challenges that have been picked up? Pallavi, what do you think? Why haven't all these things been dealt with?
This is a question that I think it's an interesting question, and I'm going to give a very frustrating answer, that EU is a government of governments. And for those of us who work with governments, we know how difficult it is to democratically come to consensus. So I'm not surprised that there has been such a lag in coming out with guidance on these really tricky issues. So from where I stand, I would actually just patch it up to bureaucracy. It's hard to get consensus on these issues. If you followed the CS3D, you saw the watering down of it in March and how difficult it was to just push it through to the last level, right? So I think something similar is happening with the EUDR implementation guidances as well.
Felipe, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, it's a relative question, right? Because, you know, when you compare with other countries, I don't think that, you know, no one is where the EU is in terms of trying to shape up how consumer parameters go about. And that happens because there's a high level of awareness. You know, plainly said, the consumers don't want to consume deforestation. And when we go back to our global agreements, that should be also the case in other countries. And consumption itself is not only through international trade. We also have domestic trade, where we have a lot of issues with the consumption of these commodities and linked to deforestation. So yeah, they're behind on the explanation, but because they're ahead on the process. That's one thing. Now, that doesn't mean that, you should be behind in the explanation. I think that when the communication was outlined, there was a clear understanding that the due diligence piece was going to be one piece of many. And I think that the EU has fallen short in terms of creating a cohesive approach. I think Pallavi's point explains to that. It's a complex system. Could be that they undermine the complexity of going, beyond the legality, if I might say. And I should say that, there's one reason why multilateralism exists. This is not a multilateral process, but multilateral process, which can be very frustrating and very slow, forces conversations, forces dialogue. And this issue requires more dialogue. I think that the enhancement of producer-consumer conversations is important. Now there's some instruments in place. Many of the member states that are really, really pushing for this have teamed up around the Team Europe initiative. And hopefully this can spearhead a better resolution. But connecting to the CS3D and the broader package of regulations, we have to be careful not to get stuck in mud and have a catalytic effect that basically puts the entire process in a stop. We have to move forward. It's not easy, but I think that backwards you don't find the answers.
Thank you, Felipe. Belinda, do you want to come in?
Yeah, exactly. Maybe just to add to that, because I think especially regarding the dialogue, I think we do have, even if we don't have the complete set of information yet, we have enough information to prepare in a lot of ways. So I do want to emphasize that at a point that there's no excuse to at the moment wait for more guidelines or for the next FAQs, as we're all awaiting these already for a while, but rather there's a lot that can already be done. And to Felipe's point regarding dialogue specifically, for example, at EU level, we have an EU Cocoa Coalition. So and I'm sure the link will be shared in the chat in a minute, where you can see how a lot of different companies can come together and can, on the one hand, share back best practices, but also learnings. And I think that's also something that comes through maybe more in other files than at the moment, the EUDR, where we're all kind of looking for how to prepare for it in the context of CSRD. So if we look at learnings of what can we report on, what have we learned about our supply chain, what is working and what isn't working, this is a great directive to actually share this transparently and consistently in a way that can be compared cross sectors as well and across different types of companies and supply chains. So while I would say, yes, there's more information that is needed, there's a lot that can be achieved through dialogue already, through best practices, and through actually going through the reporting exercises that are all coming up for us on the horizon.
Thanks very much. Well, our most popular comment so far is from anonymous attendee, a regular. There'll be several anonymous attendees. I'd be very, very interested if you could just edit your question to tell us who you are, because I think it's interesting to get the context of your question. Ultimately, this question boils down to the questioner says that they frequently hear the argument, what about the benchmarking as a way to distract from the real issue of, will companies be able to complete the mapping and geolocation of all plots of land they source from that lead to the EU? Would any of our panelists like to comment on that? Do you think this is a fair criticism? Don't worry about the benchmarking or talking about the benchmarking as a distraction from actually getting down to the complete mapping and geolocation. Belinda?
Yeah, I think it very much links to what I was just saying regarding the fact that there is the opportunity to right now do a lot of things and take a lot of action, and on the one hand collaborate, and on the other hand what I also do want to emphasize is the fact that there's already a lot of sustainability programs in place, and they might currently not always cover entire supply chains and they might be patchy, but those efforts have been going on. This is not something that we're waking up to overnight. So there's a lot of mechanisms in place that might need to be scaled and expanded, but it's not like we're starting from scratch. There's also a lot of data already out there. I think, Pallavi, you also mentioned that can be used in this context. And I think, therefore, the step now is to take action and do this by scale. And I definitely agree that benchmarking should not hold us back, because this exercise of understanding what our supply chains look like and where certain products and raw commodities come from is absolutely necessary and can be started right now.
Thank you. And the question was from Tina Schneider at World Resources Institute. Thanks for clarifying that, Tina. Okay, I want to move on to our next question, our next most liked question. It's that the EUDR and the other regulation we'll be talking about doesn't appear to permit innovation, which seems at odds with the fact that companies must innovate to comply. Is that a serious or legitimate argument? Felipe, I wondered if you wanted to comment on that.
That's a hard question to answer. I think that I would not dare to say that the EU curtails innovation. It just doesn't create the right setting that can spur innovation, right? It's a different thing. That's my opinion. I think that there's a lot of innovation out there. There's a lot of stakeholders that have decided to just tackle the issue, some of them driven because of the fact that this could open a new competitive approach. I saw how this regulation was creating a lot of confusion in countries like Argentina, but also how Argentina started to put together through the BISEC platform a scheme that has already allowed them to demonstrate how they can segregate soy exports, and this is putting them in a pole position, right? Of course, it's complex. There's different dynamics around the different existing trade structures, but innovation is happening. It's happening also at the tracing and traceability space. Now, how can we tap into this in such a way that we can find cost-effective, scalable solutions? That's a different question, and it's hard to answer at this point. We can have many things all across the place, and again, as I mentioned, the road is to hell is full of good intentions, right?
That is very true. But thank you, Felipe. Let's move on. I want to try to get through as many questions as possible. Next questioner, Ferdy van Heerden, asking what learnings can be taken from the deployment of the EUDR, ensuring a better communication and measurability for the CS3D. So, Pallavi, from your perspective, what do you think that the learnings from the EUDR process? What do you think can be translated and used to ensure better comms and measurability for CS3D?
This is a really good question, and it sounds like the person who's raised it is actually dealing with both these legislations in some capacity or the other, which is generally the case in smaller companies. I would say that one of the things that we've identified is a human rights due diligence system, which would be identical for EUDR and CS3D, should you be somewhere in the supply chain of a CS3D compliant company. So take the measures which are building blocks in all these sustainability legislations. They will not differ much for your company. Stick to the purpose of these laws rather than the noise that is going around about their implementation. I wholeheartedly echo what Belinda and Felipe have said, that, and of course, this was raised in the questions as well. Not having enough information about benchmarking is not a reason enough to not do anything about ensuring compliance with these laws. So this is what I'll say, that if you are EUDR compliant, most likely you will have gathered enough information and systems to put in place to become CS3D compliant, should you need to be. With, of course, the documentation varying a little bit, the legality of it varying. I also wanted to add about benchmarking. I don't agree fully that it's not a building block of the regulation, because Article 13 does allow companies to have a slightly lesser threshold of risk assessment and mitigation if they're sourcing from a low-risk company. So it is important to know where does this company fit in the matrix of low standard and high risk for you.
Thank you. Belinda, do you want to comment on that, on that issue?
I was still thinking about the innovation part, which I also thought quite triggering in that context, because ultimately speaking, I feel like we've mentioned multiple times now that what we are facing in that context is complex problems and that we are looking for creative solutions. So I feel like that is ultimately coming down to the definition of what innovation is. So I always find that argument quite interesting when apparently the EU is impeding on innovation, while I feel like it's very much fostering that with these files. So I would say that would be my first response. But following up on that, so I think this combination of different legislative files that we do have coming up from the EU is giving us a very nice package, and something that means that, as Felipe also already said, the EU is definitely at the forefront here, is leading and is in a driving role for responsible business conduct. And this is something that we should, and that we as businesses should also support further by basically also being, because we now have good faith regulators, to also end up being good faith implementers. Again, this is something that we can already start working on. And as Pallavi mentioned, we still have a moment for CS3D to actually kick in, which means we can get our house in order. And that's probably the learning that we can take from EUDR, where we were all more pressed for time. We do now have more time. We can take the learnings in that way and really use the time that we still have until CS3D kicks in to get our, for example, data houses for due diligence in order. Thank you.
Question from one of our French listeners. Merci beaucoup. The translation of the question: how does the EU plan to support cooperatives in the implementation of deforestation procedures, given that this is an additional cost? So yeah, who pays? Who wants to take that one? Felipe, what's your thoughts on that? What's your thinking around, how do we allocate costs here? Because inevitably change comes at a cost.
Yeah, it's a competitive process, right? And I don't think the EU intends to subsidize the transformation. It tries to generate the policy changes that fosters the ecosystem for transformation. And it happens under a competitive process, which generates all types of risks, because then costs can be, costs are going to exist. How do you go about those and be able to transform your business in such a way that you can fulfill the expectations? It's the main aim, but you can transfer costs within your own supply chains and networks of procurement and provision. And there's this big risk. We haven't talked much, but everybody knows that the risk of decoupling smallholders is enormous, right? In certain crops and commodities, the case of palm oil in Southeast Asia, it's really, really important to pay attention, but it's not the only one. Point being is that I think that instead of having the EU think, how you put resources to try to subsidize costs of transition, it's the other way around. How do we create the enabling conditions so that we can mitigate risks? And this cannot happen only from an EU standpoint. This is where the political ability of the EU has to come into play, and producer-consumer partnerships have to be developed. We fostered a dialogue with a partner organization called Proforest in Africa, and specifically in Cameroon, where we got institutional stakeholders in Cameroon to think about how producer and consumer partnerships look like. And normally we don't make that question. We're always thinking of how that could look like out of Brussels. But how can we bring the perspectives of these producer stakeholders into the mix? If you go out there and look into so many traceability instruments that exist, which ones can play out and complement what the EU is trying to put forward so that we don't duplicate costs? The metrics schemes that have been developing in Colombia through the EU Deforestation Agreements. So how do we spark an environment of collaboration, of cost-effective, common approaches that can allow us to foster innovation, minimize costs, and generate conditions in which there's a benefit sharing and that all stakeholders evolve in the right direction, right? I think that the EU has a lot to do in the creation of that environment, less than trying to see how you save the day for certain companies that might be affected. No, leaders will lead, right?
Thanks, Felipe. I wondered, Belinda, if I could bring you in just on a slightly related point, and it's a question from Monica Furl. How can this regulation, the suite of regulation, be used to strengthen voice of small-scale farmers The example of coffee is given here, 80% of production. Cocoa, similar, of course, and very much restricted into Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. So how do you think this regulation can best benefit those small-scale farmers, and how do you keep them on scope, given there's the deforestation risks there, in terms of EUDR in particular?
Yeah, I think the way that smallholder farmers and ultimately also when they come together as cooperative can be kept as part of the conversation, and definitely should be, is to put the data ownership and therefore also the data responsibility firmly with them, because ultimately, if we look at the realities in that context, this is also where the data is being collected, right? So that will definitely already logically be the point where a farm is going to be mapped by a cooperative or by a service that is employed by that farmer. So that is where the data sits in the beginning, and ultimately the farmers or the smallholder producers should also have the ability to therefore make decisions and kind of be held accountable on the one hand, but on the other hand also have the power that comes with data. So this shift in supply chains, I think, is also something that we all need to get more into the mindset of, and it links to Felipe's point a little bit regarding the avoidance of double cost and the fact that there's already loads of systems in place, because if we want to avoid double cost, that also means we try to avoid double work. And the way that we can avoid double work is by looking for the smallest common denominator. The smallest common denominator in that case, for example, taking EUDR, is going to be that farm that is mapped and that where the cocoa, coffee, whatever comes from, that is ending up with different kinds of companies. So the fact that that is the same kind of farm, and therefore the data, the GPS data that stands behind it is the smallest common denominator, is the important aspect here to say, on the one hand, this is how we can be the most efficient about it. And this is also where this pre-competitive approach actually needs to come in, where farmers need to be supported, smallholders need to be enabled in that context. And as I mentioned in the beginning, I do see this as a company responsibility, and ultimately also something that I really don't like to label as a cost, because ultimately we are talking about an impact investment in that context. If we're not dealing with this, we are facing, as already mentioned in the beginning, a crisis in the context of climate change as well as poverty. All of these have long-term bad effects for any kind of business. Therefore, this is rather an impact investment for the mid and the long term, and something that we all need to address to deal with supply chain risks over the longer term.
Thank you, Belinda. Pallavi, I have a question for you. In relation to, I think, the EUDR, we have a question around indications whether the European Union might expand Annex 1, or whether this will fall by the wayside as the European Union timber regulation did. Firstly, perhaps you could outline what Annex 1, to those of us who aren't fully on top of the regulation, is, and then are you seeing any indication that it might fall by the wayside? Pallavi.
Thank you, Ian. So I personally call Annex 1 a great news for everyone working on this law, because it very clearly specifies which commodities, which products associated with these commodities have to be reported on. So if you're making chocolates, then yes, but if you're making, I don't know, a derivative products of chocolate and it's not included in Annex 1, then you do not have to report your compliance with the EUDR. Please continue complying with this law because it's a great law, but you don't have to report on it in the deadline. In terms of revision of Annex, yes, we are expecting that next year in 2025, it may be expanded to include other commodities. One that I've been hearing about a lot is corn, maize. The other thing that I have been hearing about a lot is cotton, because these two commodities have also historically been associated with large-scale deforestation. There is no news as yet, but they were expected to revise the annex in 2 years of the implementation, which would be around May of 2025. So watch the space. We'll keep you posted.
Thank you. Collaboration, something that's clearly very important. We have a specific question on that, and I know we've covered it a little bit, but I would like to come to Felipe on this. Why are we not seeing more corporate or company-to-company collaboration, Felipe, do you think?
No, I think the collaboration is taking place. First, I think there are a lot of collective efforts to try to understand what the EUDR entails. We in the Tropical Forest Alliance have fostered a lot of dialogue and communication through a working group on the matter. But beyond that, we've seen different corporate stakeholders within the different links of the supply chain trying to go about this. We have a group of meat players that have started to collaborate around a series of roadmaps to address deforestation in soy, palm oil, and the beef. The Consumer Goods Forum Forest Positive Coalition of Action has a long track record of trying to address this from a retailer and manufacturer standpoint of corporate action. And there's even conversations within those different groups and trying to build bridges with the governments. As a matter of fact, now in New York Climate Week, there's going to be a joint session between the Consumer Goods Forum and the Sustainable Commodities Forum. So there are efforts. Now, the question is, how can we maximize this collaboration? How we can make sure that the private force can, be more not aggressive, but more diligent and more intentional in trying to shape up the model. I think that it's a tricky equation because at the end of the day, there's a search for the efficiency and of course for the business model to run smoothly week by week, because there's a lot of you have bills to pay, right? And you have expectations to fulfill. But this is where we have to have feet on the ground and eyes on the horizon, and take this as an opportunity to shape a new business space where those that are really investing in innovative approaches to good practices can profit from that. I think we should look at this as a way of changing the way we can go about our economy. And I hope that the private sector, corporate leadership stands up and is able to transform this. You don't have to have fear against the odds. You have to look at the odds as even if they're against you, as a way of having a new innovative approach towards the future.
Okay, thanks, Felipe. I'd like to, Pallavi, a quick question for you, and I'd like Belinda's thoughts on this one as well. The challenge of verification. Susanna Neumann, thanks for the question, points out that in many respects, businesses are left having to verify data themselves, and sometimes the data comes from places where it's tricky. She gives the example of China. Pallavi, how would you recommend going about that? Because obviously you're potentially leaving yourself open to risks there.
That's a great question. And unfortunately, specifically China, remains as one of the more complex jurisdictions to source from. In terms of how you can assess the sort of like where these documents stand, I mentioned at the beginning of my intervention that it would be great to have some sort of guidance from the EU, some examples in terms of what kind of documents are expected and accepted to prove compliance with certain regulations, and second, what is the threshold of risk when you look at these documents. In terms of how you can go about it, so I have been working with companies who are sourcing with China, and I have been using the same thresholds that we use for human rights due diligence. Where is it? You get documents, then you have your local experts verify those documents, and then you have open source intelligence to make sure that you doubly verify that information, ensuring that it's in alignment with what you're requiring to do. So this is one of the ways you can go on verifying the information that you collect from your suppliers. Whether it would be exactly what the EU has in mind, we will find out in the course of maybe the next few months.
Thanks, Pallavi. Belinda, do you want to comment briefly on the sort of challenges for verification of data? I would imagine Tony's Chocolonely primarily will be sourcing from Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on the one hand, definitely regarding data collection, I think that it's always a great question how to go about data quality and how to verify the data. I think there's multiple parts to the answer of that question. So first of all, it is about having teams for us in Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire. So part of our impact team is actually also based in country. So I think already that connection, then the long-term and direct relationship to the partner cooperatives also means there is this open line of communication. But then there is also this aspect of having an objective assessment. So in our case, that means that our annual report is third-party verified. So we get assurance by PwC in this context, and this assurance is twofold. So on the one hand, we have in total 15 non-financial KPIs. So these are partly related to, for example, our operational traceability. Partly they are related to the child labor cases that we definitely do find in our supply chain. So there's definitely a quite big exercise of also third-party assessments of the data that we do collect. However, that goes even further, and that already links into parts of also what falls into the CSRD scope is limited text assurance. So also not only the data, but what are the insights that we are pulling out of that and therefore claiming in our reporting itself. Also, that is assured for us by PwC. And to be very honest, I think this is one of the best exercises that we annually do, because not only does that show us where we're currently at, we report on the past, or in total, we report on 3 years, so 2 past years and the current reporting year, but also it always sharpens our impact approach, because that actually demonstrates certain aspects of where we need to tweak our sustainability approach to, for example, actually address the situation in producing countries. I already mentioned the cooperative fee a couple of times. What we have set up when at first was a higher price. So we're following the living income reference price. We did, however, realize that our 5 sourcing principles require more than that for the cooperatives to be functional businesses. That means that over time, we have added this cooperative fee as a learning out of the data that was externally assessed and the understanding that we could gather from that. So I would basically encourage companies to be open, take these learnings in, and spar with a third-party assurance in that context to really get a better understanding of where you're at and what learnings you can use to improve your sustainability approach.
Thank you, Belinda. Pallavi, a very quick question, and then I'll come to a final question for everybody. Just very briefly, Pallavi, can you share, you mentioned cotton farming, can you share a little bit of how you see regulations affecting cotton? Just very, I know it's a big question, but just very briefly.
So, to assure you, cotton is not one of the commodities under the EUDR, but I would say that if you're a cotton producer or if a sourcer from a region where deforestation is linked with cotton, I would say start prepping your systems, assuming that at a future date, this could be included in the annex. Also, it will help you, as Belinda said, it will help you comply with other laws that are coming in. European forced labor regulation is going to come in soon. CS3D is already here. So assume that you would be one of the people to be complying with this at a later part in the next 2 years.
Thank you, Pallavi. Okay, final question, and it reflects another question we've had, hint, and it links with others, several other questions actually. Going forwards then, given all the conversation we've had, what should companies be focusing on now? What are the big challenges they need to address, but where should their focus be right now? Brief answers, please, because we're coming towards the end of our time. Felipe, briefly, what do you recommend companies should focus on right now?
Yes, I think that, keep the eyes on the ball. I think that in the year to come, there's going to be a lot of tension and a lot of pressure. I think companies have to really focus on their systems and try to make sure that they're able to go about all the difficulties without, decoupling stakeholders. And as you do that, don't lose sight of the ball, don't lose sight of the bigger objective, which is try to have competitive in the long run. I should add to what Pallavi mentioned. The corporate leadership is not only companies that are trading commodities. The finance sector is quite embedded in this. They're not looking at this within a context of XYZ commodity. It's a risk issue from a capital investment perspective. So keep an eye on the bigger picture as you go out the white water in the immediate term.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Belinda, 30 seconds, please.
I'll make it even shorter. While prepping for all of these files, keep the beginning of the supply chain and the smallholders in the dialogue and in mind as probably the most important stakeholder to ultimately implement your due diligence.
Great, thank you very much. And Pallavi, last word to you. Again, briefly.
Adding to what Felipe and Belinda has said, regulation is a good thing. Consider this as a positive thing for your business. In the next 2 years, it'll actually make your life much easier as opposed to these patchwork of legislations everywhere. So consider this as a good thing with a tumultuous transition period in the next couple of years.
Thank you. Okay, I'm going to have to bring the discussion to a close as we are running out of time. Many thanks to our panel for their time and insight today. It's been a really great conversation. And thanks to you all for your questions, some really great questions there. What we've been talking about just now will be on the agenda at the Sustainable Commodities and Land Use Conference in Amsterdam on 22nd and 23rd of October, just around the corner. Full details on the Innovation Forum website, and you can click on the webinar link and it will now redirect you to the conference landing page. And do look out for more content on on regulation related to commodities and land use in next week's Innovation Forum newsletter. We'll be in touch in the next few days to share the audio and video recordings of this webinar. So watch again and listen again at your leisure and share with your colleagues. But for now, I hope you found the webinar useful. I've been Ian Welsh. Thanks for watching and goodbye.